The Eurovision 2025 season is already getting underway, and if 2024 was anything to go by, we're in for a hell of a ride, both good and bad. We don't know much yet, but there are some things that we can be absolutely certain, or at least I'm pretty confident, will not happen this year, including in relation to some of 2024 Eurovision's biggest scandals. Today we're going to go through some of them, so coming up are 10 things that won't happen at Eurovision this year. Before we get into it, make sure to like the video and to subscribe to the channel as always if you enjoy it. You can follow me and my editor Jay on our socials that are all in the description, and if you want to support the channel financially you can do so on Ko-fi or Patreon. All of the links again are down below. Now let's get into what you can not expect to see at Eurovision this year, and we're starting with one of last year's biggest controversies. The first thing that won't happen at Eurovision 2025 is a repeat of the events that led to Joost Klein's disqualification. Unfortunately, it wasn't a positive story that ended up being one of the biggest headlines at Eurovision last year. We've gone through this at length before, primarily in my Eurovision 2024 was a complete disaster video, as well as the Eurovision 2024 winners and losers video, so I'm not going to go into depth on the full timeline again here. The key thing for the purposes of this video is that the environment that ended up putting Joost in the position that he was in has been fundamentally changed quite dramatically, and in theory, so have the procedures surrounding artists' well-being. There's a couple of different reasons for this. Firstly, there are some procedural changes. These are mainly around the rehearsal schedules, which are going to be optimized, whatever that means. And secondly, more rehearsals are going to be conducted behind closed doors to reduce pressure on the artists. We don't really have much detail at this point, and we don't know exactly what this will mean in practice. That said, I'm quite optimistic given how high level the discussions were between Eurovision's organisers, the European Broadcasting Union, or EBU, and the Dutch broadcaster, with the Dutch broadcaster ultimately being persuaded to stay in the contest. Let's not forget, after Joost's disqualification, there was a serious chance that they might withdraw altogether. At the same time, these procedural changes are only the small part of what has changed with the contest this year. The much more significant change in this area is that there is now a new code of conduct which has been implemented. This code puts a lot of things in writing that were implicit in the rules before but not explicit. These rules also weren't as publicly known as they are now. Some of the behaviours that the new code of conduct explicitly prohibits are clearly directly related to incidents that took place at the 2024 contest. This includes filming without permission, something repeatedly done by the Israeli delegation, more on them later, and rules around hostile and intimidating body language. We should remember that that formed a large part of the justification behind Joost Klein's disqualification. In addition, this code of conduct creates a body to actually enforce these rules, called the Code of Conduct Committee. That means that if you are a dick, you will be forced to answer to the cock. There will also be a specific code of conduct manager who delegations will be able to report breaches to. All of this sounds promising, but we won't really know how it's going to be enforced until we see it in practice in Basel. In addition, there is rightly some concern in some quarters about the clause that says participants can express themselves freely in a personal capacity, but must avoid linking political views to their Eurovision participation. They must not instrumentalize the contest or use the contest as leverage by making political statements or causing controversies. This is really broad. There is also a really fine line between speaking in a personal capacity and linking your political views to your Eurovision participation. What I will say is that the EBU clearly does know that it can't go around slapping sanctions on every single artist who expresses any kind of political view, whether that's in relation to Palestine or otherwise. In addition to that, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a degree of leniency in terms of not immediately going to massive fines or whatever else. At the same time, I think it's really important that these kinds of decisions made by the Code of Conduct Committee, especially when it comes to politics, are made in a way that is transparent so that they can be scrutinized by the media and others. There is rightly some serious distrust at the moment between fans and the EBU. And for that reason, in order to rebuild that trust, they have to have a chance to get it right this time. But at the same time, it's completely reasonable for fans to remain skeptical and to look at this code of conduct and say, I'll believe it when I see it. I would be really gutted if an artist engaging in good faith politically on an issue that matters to them was punished for that because there was some way in which it could be tangentially related to their participation at Eurovision. Hopefully, this will primarily focus on the on-stage performance, which would basically keep the rules essentially the same as they are now on this topic. I have 9 more things to get through, and we've already spoken for several minutes about this, so I am going to move on, but you can expect this to remain a theme for the rest of the season. I and others will be keeping a close eye on how this develops. The next one on the list of things that won't happen is one that hurts my heart a little bit. That is a Celine Dion performance in person at the contest. Some of you might not have already known that Celine Dion's big break in the music industry came through the Eurovision Song Contest. Yes, I know she's Canadian. You can represent countries other than your own at Eurovision. The UK's last winners had an American singing. It's not really that big a deal. Anyway, back to the point. Celine Dion has unfortunately been really unwell with a debilitating condition called stiff person syndrome. This has essentially forced her to relearn how to sing. She made a dramatic and triumphant return to the global stage at the Olympics last year. I still get goosebumps thinking about that performance on top of the Eiffel Tower. Naturally, given that this is the first time Switzerland has hosted Eurovision since the year after she won it, there has been some wishful speculation that the host broadcaster might invite Celine to do a performance at the contest this year. Sadly, as much as I love the idea, I think it's pretty unlikely to happen, and there's a few reasons why. She has only performed once since the Olympics in public. That was at a charity gala in November, and there's nothing to suggest that she's planning any further performances in the near future. In addition to that, the uncertainty of a condition as debilitating as stiff person syndrome is going to make it really difficult to commit to performances. All Celine Dion wants to do is sing on stage. She said that herself in interviews. If she is having to space out performances months and months apart, it's clear that they really take a lot of preparation, a lot of physiotherapy and everything else to get her in a position where she's able to do it. For that reason, the logistical challenges just seem unfortunately too great. That said, there is a reason why I've said I'm only ruling out an appearance in person. I think there's every chance that she could give a virtual message, maybe a video message to be played at some point during the final. It would also be really amazing to see some kind of interval act dedicated to Celine. The standard thing to do here would be to find some previous Eurovision winners, stick them all on stage, and get them to sing a big medley. Speaking of which, the next thing we're not going to see at Eurovision 2025 is Måns Zelmerlöw. In any normal year, I wouldn't just pick out an old winner and say, oh, we're not going to see them, but I'm pretty sure about it with Måns this year. He's attempting to return to Eurovision via the Swedish national selection at Melodifestivalen. For whatever reason, he's currently considered an overwhelming favourite to win the selection, despite the fact we haven't heard a single one of the songs yet. Don't get me wrong, Heroes was a perfectly fine winner, and to be honest, I don't really think it deserves the hate that it gets. Don't forget to watch my video ranking all of the winners since the year 2000 for more opinions on that. But the idea that Måns is an overwhelming favourite like Loreen was when she returned is just extremely far-fetched. We should remember that even Loreen failed to make it back to Eurovision on her first attempt after winning. Statements, and it was robbed, didn't even make it to the final. In addition to that, with the exception of Loreen in 2023, no other recent Swedish Eurovision participant has successfully managed to make it back to the contest a second time, and plenty have tried. Those include Anna Bergendahl, Robin Bengtsson, John Lundvik, and Erik Saade. Because of that, I'm really skeptical that after 10 years away, Måns is suddenly going to find the secret sauce to winning Melodifestivalen again. This is especially given the fact that his recent albums and singles have been doing worse and worse in the Swedish charts. His only entry into the top 50 in Sweden since 2016 was a Christmas special collab with Carola. There is of course the chance that Måns comes on as an interval act instead. That's only going to happen if, for some reason, the producers decide it's a great idea for him to sing My Heart Will Go On. Otherwise, he's not going to be on our screens anytime soon. The next thing that definitely won't happen at Eurovision this year is the ridiculous back and forth around the lyrics of the Israeli song. This year, it took several attempts for the Israeli broadcaster to submit something to the EBU for the contest that wasn't considered too political. In general, Israel's participation was the biggest controversy of the contest last year. Unfortunately, this is going to roll into 2025 as well. As I film this, it looks, hopefully, like a ceasefire in Gaza is about to be agreed. But whether that happens or not isn't going to change the fact that Israel's participation is going to be a major source of controversy again. With that in mind, though, I think we will see a bit of a change of tack from the Israeli broadcaster in how they approach the contest this year. You're certainly not going to see them repeatedly submit songs that are obviously going to get rejected. I do still wonder whether, if it weren't for the fact that the president of Israel had intervened last year, Khan would have just kept submitting songs that weren't valid and eventually be forced to withdraw. This year, I think Israel is probably going to try and tell a different story at the contest. While last year's entry was clearly about the October 7th attacks perpetrated by Hamas, that's not really something that you can do 2 years in a row. For that reason, I think we'll get a different angle. I will probably not comment on their song this year. If I do, it will be in the same context as last year. I don't believe their participation is ethical, ceasefire or not, and I think it's a terrible shame that the EBU is once again allowing them in. In any case, unless the delegation is really stupid, they will surely keep a lower profile than they did in 2024. That means not spending the entire week harassing literally anyone who dares to say even one word about potentially being uncomfortable with their presence at the event. As we already mentioned, there are a whole series of provisions in the new code of conduct that clearly explicitly refer to things that Israeli delegation members were doing last year. If the delegation does not follow the code of conduct to the letter, you can expect that they will get absolutely shafted by the cock. With that, we're going to move on, and unfortunately, I'm not too pleased about the next one either. We will not be seeing a Eurovision Song Contest free of AI. If you include national final season, this one has already come true. The examples of AI so far have mostly been harmless. For example, a group of Ukrainian pranksters entered an AI-generated song into the Moldovan national final, and it actually got shortlisted. But more seriously, if we get through the entire season without at least one major national final having an AI-authored or AI-assisted song in it, I would be really surprised. As artificial intelligence continues to encroach on creative industries, we're going to see more and more examples of its use in songwriting processes and to produce graphics as well. It should be reinforced here that AI is not creating or writing anything here, because in both cases, AI is only capable of regurgitating pastiches of whatever material it is trained on. That means an enormous amount of music and art that the original artists didn't give permission for the models to use. There's a word for this: theft. Given the EBU leadership's previous statements specifically to do with AI in a Eurovision context, I am genuinely still hopeful that we will see some kind of change in the future and that this will be the last Eurovision to take place without specific protections to safeguard the contest's integrity. That said, given how reactive the changes were after the 2024 contest, I'm worried it's going to require some kind of high-profile AI-related scandal or an entry which uses AI in a significant way, doing really well, to force some change. That doesn't have to be necessary, and if it wanted to, the EBU could absolutely make these changes now. I don't think there would be particularly significant pushback from broadcasters either. Perhaps naively, I'm still hoping for proactive action, but as you can tell from the fact it's on this list, I'm not feeling optimistic. The next one I wouldn't have put on this list if it weren't for the fact that the national broadcaster has totally put their foot in it this week. The next thing that won't happen at Eurovision 2025 is Germany winning. Inexplicably, the program director of Germany's national broadcaster, ARD, which, as we all know, stands for Arbeitsgemeinschaft der öffentlich-rechtlichen Rundfunkanstalten der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, decided to pile a load of pressure on up front this year by saying in an interview that our goal is and remains victory. We are not thinking about what will happen if it does not work out. I am confident that the partnership will work. Nothing less than victory justifies such a collaboration. She then went on to say that the German national final this year, Chefsache ESC, as well as the partnership they struck with Stefan Raab to produce the show, who is the only person in Germany who seems to know anything about Eurovision, will end if the targeted victory is not achieved. This would be a ridiculously high bar to set for any country, but for Germany, it's completely insane. Stefan Raab does have a very good record with Germany in Eurovision, with a win under his belt with Lena in 2010, as well as a string of top 10 finishes. He even did it himself one year, and to be honest, I have to really respect the level of showmanship required to bring a song to Eurovision called Wada Hada Duda Da and sell it so well to the European public that you end up in the top 5. Oh my God! He is real! Yeah! Unfortunately, that was a long time ago, and the contest has evolved a lot since then. There's no evidence that Stephenson has done the same. I also really doubt that there'll be all that many artists with an established profile who will be willing to go through both heats and a semi-final to even have a shot at making it to Eurovision. There is, of course, a chance that I will end up looking extremely stupid in May, having made this call already in January. But you can't make statements as bizarre as the ones that have come from the German broadcaster and get away with it. If you look back through most recent Eurovision winners, you can point to steps and processes and institutional knowledge that was built up over years before their win. Italy, Sweden and Ukraine are powerhouses of the contest, and Switzerland have been refining their internal procedures for years and years before 2024. For Germany, in its current state with the contest, it is simply not something that can become a reality in 1 year unless there is an extraordinary miracle. One day, I am sure that Germany will win the contest again, but no, 2025 will not be that year. The next thing that we won't see at Eurovision 2025 is a major change to the scoreboard or the presentation of the results. This is something that the host broadcasters often cite as a potential place where they could make changes to the format. This is usually done in the context of trying to remove some runtime from the show. Sweden tried this in 2024, and while they did manage to reduce the runtime a bit by about 10 to 15 minutes, it was nowhere near as much as the 45 minutes plus that they had promised. Usually, these attempts involve cutting bits of the results show out, or streamlining them in some way. The latest to try this was actually the Spanish broadcaster RTVE at this year's Junior Eurovision Song Contest. They revealed all of the 1 points first, then all of the 2s, then all of the 3s, and so on. Unfortunately, they used these really confusing bar graphs to do it that then broke after Georgia scored more points than the graph was designed to contain. The Swedes are very, very able on a technical front when it comes to Eurovision, and the fact that they were able to produce technically such a high quality show on 3 occasions in the last 15 years goes to demonstrate that. But if they can't get the show under 4 hours, then nobody can. I'm half expecting the Swiss to promise to try to do it at some point and then end up in exactly the same place as everyone else. What will happen is a change will be implied in some way at some point. Everyone will lose their minds and panic. There'll be 20 or more fake leaks, all of which suggest some kind of bizarre change, and then we will end up in May with broadly the same thing that we started with. Another thing we won't be seeing at Eurovision 2025 will be Martin Österdahl, at least not in the arena. I predicted after Eurovision 2024 that Martin Österdahl would no longer be the executive supervisor of the show by this year's contest. I was wrong. However, there has now been a pretty major restructuring behind the scenes, which has divided up the executive supervisor's responsibilities into multiple roles. To be fair, these responsibilities were far too broad, and it was always going to be totally impossible if something went wrong for the executive supervisor to do everything. The reason that Martin Österdahl is still here on this list, though, is that traditionally during the show, the executive supervisor has a brief piece to camera in the arena where he confirms that the results are ready to be given. In 2024, you may remember that after a less than harmonious few days, this happened.
Yeah, good evening. So the moment of truth has arrived.
This segment was actually still retained for the Junior Eurovision Song Contest in Madrid last month, or at least initially it was. After Martin Österdahl was booed in the rehearsal by the crowd, they scrapped the segment entirely. To be honest, given how bad of a look it is to have the audience booing during the show, I'm not surprised the producers made that decision. Fans were fully justified last year to express their disappointment and anger at how the show had been handled. Martin Österdahl himself even said that if an outlet for frustration and disappointment was needed, booing is perfectly fine with me. That said, I don't think it's something that any producer would particularly want to risk a repeat performance of. For that reason, I don't think the EBU will be particularly opposed to its removal from the show, at least for this year. At most, we'll get a piece to camera taken outside of the arena with either no or very little in-arena sound. This one could be a little controversial. Another thing that won't happen at Eurovision 2025 is another jury-led victory. Maybe this is wishful thinking, but hear me out. For the last 2 years now, we've had a very dramatically different preference between the jury and the televote as to who should win the contest. Croatia and Switzerland were in that pickle in 2024, and in 2023 it was Finland and Sweden. For what it's worth, while I do think there are underlying issues with the juries still, I actually think they did a better job in 2024 than they did in 23. There is no doubt that Switzerland's performance was the most technically difficult to execute, both in terms of staging and in terms of vocals. The jury's job is, at least in part, to recognise that. In addition to that, Croatia did also score more than 200 points with the juries. Had Switzerland not also done really well with the televote, Croatia would have won the contest. Baby Lasagna would have been such a deserving winner too, and that would have been one of the most incredible fairy tales in Eurovision history. At the same time, while 2024 was more understandable, it still is definitely a buzzkill to see the result basically be decided before the public has even given its points. I was delighted to see Nemo win, and The Code was one of my favourite songs of the year, but I would have loved to seen them win it in a slightly more dramatic finish. Luckily, those massive jury wins we've seen in the last 2 years are complete anomalies compared to the contests that came before. Only 4 songs have ever received more than 300 points from the juries at Eurovision. It only requires a glance at the top 10 of all time to see that the percentage of total available points that the last 2 winners received from the juries is extremely unusual. When compared with the equivalent list of the televote, you can actually see that on average, the public are way more prone to piling onto a single entry than juries are. On average, the televote has always decided the outcome, and the juries hadn't placed a single winner higher than the televote did in any year since the new voting system was introduced in 2016, until the last 2 years. The argument has also been made that the fact that the juries don't vote in the semi-finals anymore means that more televote-friendly songs make it to the final, diluting the televote's power and focusing jury votes onto a small number of songs. The reality is, juries and televoters agreed on almost every single qualifier, right through from 2016 when the new system came in, up until the year where the jury's influence was removed. For that reason, I think we need to zoom out a little bit and realise what the actual situation is. It is far more likely that the televote overrule the jury than the other way round. The last 2 years have been exceptions, not the rule, and the probability remains that in the coming year, the televote will decide, just as it did every single year from 2016 to 2022. The last thing we won't see this year is any Italians singing Imagine by John Lennon in the press centre.
Living life in peace.
Firstly, nobody is going to pull a stunt as utterly surreal as this one, because Italy probably, and I say probably, won't repeat the mistake of having their televote results leaked and published on their own broadcast, and therefore magically requiring some kind of headline-grabbing thing from their contestant the following day to distract everyone. These two things are not related. Surely not. But if a weird stunt was pulled again, you can guarantee it will be recorded and on the internet in minutes, and that's because of fan media. We have every reason to believe that the EBU is going to keep fan media in the press centre for 2025. I know that might be a disappointment, especially to those of you out there who disagree with us in fan media talking about some of the more difficult subjects related to Eurovision, but that's how it's going to be. That said, it's clear there's going to be some changes in how the relationship between fan media and the EBU works this year. The first thing is the term fan media, which has been abolished entirely. It's been replaced with a new category called Eurovision Focused Media. In addition, it's been rolled into the M category of accreditations, that's the media category, along with other types of traditional media outlets. This might just seem like minor semantics, but I actually think it's quite significant, especially when you combine it with the fact that the EBU has been inviting fan media sites to online workshops ahead of the contest. I do get why there has been so much cynicism around those workshops in particular. That said, I do think it's important to engage in good faith on these things, and I think for now, on this specific issue, we have to assume good faith from the EBU if we want a productive relationship. Those changes I just mentioned, in my opinion, indicate some semblance of an equivalence of fan media in this context with traditional media. That's an important recognition of the work we do as a community and for the contest, as well as the work we do to hold it to account when necessary. In short, we're being taken more seriously, and I have faith that as a community we'll step up to the plate on that. The long and short of it is, fan media remains a deeply ingrained part of the contest, but it's vital for us to keep our standards up and put our best foot forward whenever we can. That doesn't mean that we can't be as full of joy as we always have been as fans. In fact, that's one of the things I treasure most about the Eurovision community and about being involved in fan media. I just think it means we have to continue the upward trajectory that fan media has been on in the last few years. Knowing how amazing so many of the people who work in this area are across so many different outlets, I'm confident that we are going to bring our A game this year. And besides, at the end of the day, if it weren't for fan media, instead of thinking about Angelina Mango in the press centre when you hear Imagine by John Lennon, instead you'd think of this.
Imagine there's no heaven.
With that, it's time to end the video. We're starting to see how the contest is going to look in 2025. I'll do my best over the next few months to make that as entertaining as possible. At the same time, we're not going to shy away from the serious subject and not going to shy away from the difficult conversations when we need to have them. As things get intense over the next few weeks and the national finals start pouring in February, we'll hopefully see a contest that is a little better and a little calmer than it was in 2024. In the meantime, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and if you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you again in 7 days' time.